Hi everybody, it's Clark Camper with the September edition of Wall Street and Washington. Today I'd like to cover three things. First, I'd like to talk about the presidential election. Second, I'd like to talk a bit about the U.S. fiscal landscape. And third, I'd like to talk about a counterintuitive analysis of the Dodd-Frank Act as it would be affected by the outcome of the presidential election. First, in terms of the election itself, the question I get asked most often is what do I think is going to happen in terms of the outcome of the election? My answer has not changed in many months, and that is that I believe this race is going to be very, very tight. Conventional wisdom has swung around, having one candidate up and down, as we've seen in previous months. Right now, conventional wisdom is that the president is likely to be reelected. That's based largely on a number of polls that have shown him with a relatively small but pretty durable lead, certainly nationally and in a number of the key swing states. Why do I, in the face of that, though, continue to say I think the election's going to be close? Well, it's because if you actually scratch the surface of those polls, I think you see a little bit different result from the overall takeaway, and that is that if you look particularly at likely voters, not just registered voters, which are usually comprise these polls, if you look at likely voters, actually then it turns into a virtual tie between Obama and Romney. And in particular, if you look at the number of likely voters who say that they might actually switch their vote, that's pretty consistently been around 10% in most of the polls that I've seen. That's obviously a large share of the electorate. That says to me that, again, there are a lot of votes out there that could swing either way. Again, ultimately, my take is at this point, the election is very, very tight. Now, I would say if you enjoy looking at polls, and I certainly do, but if you enjoy looking at polls, fine, go ahead, look at them now, day in, day out. But I think when it really is going to start to count is in October, maybe October 7, 8, 9 or so. Why do I say that? Well, it's because October 3rd is the first presidential debate. I think after that debate, if you see Obama with a continued solid lead, I think at that point then you can start to believe the polls. But again, until then, I believe that this race is very, very tight and could go either way. Moving on to my second topic, the U.S. fiscal landscape, I wanted to quickly cover two things. First is the averting a government shutdown. As I have discussed in previous editions of Wall Street and Washington, there's been some talk about a possible government shutdown. How would that have happened? Well, because the U.S. fiscal year starts October 1. There was a point a couple months back where it looked like both parties might be looking for a fight, and there was some threat that the government actually would shut down. Both parties decided that would be politically inadvisable. And so what's happened is that as I speak, Congress is nearing a stopgap funding measure that would continue funding at current levels for another 6 months. And that obviously averts the shutdown and gives a fair amount of breathing room to try to deal with other things like the fiscal cliff, which I want to turn to now. So in terms of the fiscal cliff, I've said all along and continue to believe that it is extremely unlikely Congress is going to act on the fiscal cliff before the election. There's some talk about it on the campaign trail, both Obama and Romney talking a lot about taxes, a lot about deficits, but the bottom line is the groundwork, the key staff in Washington, groundwork isn't being laid because key staff in Washington are not talking about these issues. Nothing's going to happen on the fiscal cliff before the election. Now, the real issue is what happens in the lame duck session, if anything, after the election and the time before the new government takes over in January. People have varied opinions on this. A number of people think that the two parties are not going to be able to come to agreement. They're dug so far in. They may think that there's some tactical advantage in actually not coming to agreement and will sail off that fiscal cliff January 1. The Bush tax cuts will expire, some spending cuts will hit, and the thinking then is that maybe one way or another that'll force Congress actually to come together and come to a grander bargain or a grander agreement. My personal feeling is that won't happen. I think that, as I've said all along, this Congress is very partisan, but they're not crazy. I think that the most likely outcome is that Congress is going to wheel that big old can into place. One way or another, they're going to find a way to avert the expiration of the Bush tax cuts and to avert those spending cuts that I referenced, and they're going to give themselves maybe 6 months, 9 months to try to come to a grand bargain. Now, what happens then, it's anybody's guess. The outcome of the election will be very, very important, and we'll talk about that in editions of Wall Street and Washington at that time. Finally, I want to close with a few words about Dodd-Frank, and I have sort of a counterintuitive take on Dodd-Frank. I get asked all the time, is Dodd-Frank going to be repealed if Romney is elected? And that comes out of the fact that Romney says on the stump that one of his priorities is to repeal Dodd-Frank. He'll do it on the first day, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm not making a political statement, and I'm also not casting aspersions on the intention, the sincerity behind those words, but as a practical matter, there are not the votes in Congress to repeal Dodd-Frank. Absent a landslide in November for one party or the other, neither parties, which I don't expect, by the way, and I don't think any analyst that I know that is credible does expect, but absent a landslide like that, neither party is going to have the 60 votes necessary to control in the Senate, and there will not be a path forward to actually be able to repeal Dodd-Frank. Where would that leave us? Let's think about the outcome of the election then. If President Obama is reelected, it'll be status quo. And as we've seen, status quo means that basically Dodd-Frank is nearing finalization in terms of implementation. Certainly deadlines have been missed. It's been a bit slow, but as I've said, particularly the derivatives provisions of Dodd-Frank are likely to be finalized within the next 6 months to a year. So status quo is Dodd-Frank is going to be implemented. What would happen if Romney were elected? Well, interestingly, I think that despite the desire to repeal Dodd-Frank, it actually would create more uncertainty. Why do I say that? Well, let's say the statute exists, the statute's not going to be repealed. You get a Romney administration that comes in that appoints people at the regulatory agencies and policy positions that are relatively hostile to Dodd-Frank. They likely will try to slow walk or stop altogether implementation of Dodd-Frank, and that would leave us in kind of a uncertain, funny place. Statute existing, but implementation kind of hanging out here, half implemented, half not. So that's why I say in a counterintuitive way, I think actually a Romney victory would create more uncertainty around Dodd-Frank. With that, I'll wrap things up, and we'll see you next month on Wall Street and Washington.